Samuel, over to you.
Thank you very much. It's exciting to have the only slot going right now before lunch. So even though people are hungry, wanting to do other things, you're all in here, and also fun to be up on the big stage for the last talk I'm giving, which is just a nice energy boost after quite an exciting long week. And in broader context here, what I'm going to be presenting, looking at angler views of catch and release best practices and where they're getting this information, is a topic that first came to my attention coming to this conference in Canada in 2017 before starting my PhD work. And at the time, it was a very open project, could do essentially whatever I wanted. I was reading interesting papers, looking at catch and release best practice information and how this is being communicated in different areas and what's actually needed to get regulations to work and what agencies are trying to use this. There's interesting gaps around what was known, what wasn't, and what were anglers actually doing. And being in Sweden, relatively new to the country, and learning about how fisheries are managed, these questions I thought were particularly interesting in the context of an area where along the coast and in the big lakes and these orange areas, the government sets rules and regulations. They have resources similar to some of the groups here. But the majority of fishing in the country is managed by these thousands of individual water owners who set the rules, set access, and potentially could be communicating this type of best practice information or not. And that in this context, there's so many different things going on. There's a lot to learn and maybe a lot of opportunities to improve what's being put forward. And this spurred a series of projects, starting with a master's thesis and then a publication that we presented in Australia last time round, where we looked at these private organizations, how many of them have rules requiring catch and release, which the majority of them do, but then that's rarely paired with best practice information, and that the information that is there is usually quite limited. It's focused only on particular species or particular types of fisheries, and miss the most caught and the most released species in the country. And this is just what's going on in the privately managed fisheries and the information they're presenting. So big knowledge gaps, but also that's just one actor in the broader recreational fisheries landscape here. So in that information landscape, we want to know if the anglers aren't getting this information from these license sellers, where are they getting this information? Do they think they're getting enough information on catch and release best practices from them? And pairing that with, do they think they're getting enough information on regulations, because we know how much there is for each of these things? And then clicker's real great here, and I can't see my speaking notes to just keep going. If they're not getting them there, where are they getting this information from? And then beyond that, to try and come up with some measure of whether or not they're likely to be complying or their level of willingness to adopt the best practices. We also had an interesting context where we could ask how many of them or how they feel about their role as becoming fishery supervisors. So you can, as a private citizen, become like a conservation officer in the Swedish context, which would imply if you're going to enforce the rules, you're probably likely to follow them, and probably also thinking that you might be also acting as a role model and following and using catch and release best practices. So to do this, we surveyed our favorite group of respondents, which has its biases and things, but we've investigated that in a separate study and looked at which management structure people are fishing under, where in the country they're fishing, what species they're targeting, to try and look at where could this information be coming from, and is it actually filling in the gaps that the private water holders are not filling in. And so start off by asking how much are they getting about fishing regulations from various sources. And at the top, as would be expected in this group, they list the NGO as giving a lot of information. And second, the water owners, which makes sense given how much of fishing in the country they manage and that they actually are providing regulation information. But interestingly, they put anglers as the third most important source, even though the government does actually set the regulations for a large percentage of the fishing in the country, which shows maybe lack of clear communication, which links to how licenses are sold and things in the public waters, also potentially a lack of further communication of what's available for how to actually perform catch and release in cases where regulations require it. So we dove into this into like various other categories, and I'm just going to show one section here, looking at comparing between people who are choosing to fish more in public waters or more in private waters, where this breakdown gets a little bit more interesting. So where they're getting this information from, as well as just their overall perspective on how much information is available. And in the context of what was asked for on one of the talks earlier, highlighting a failure, we didn't ask enough questions. This was something I tried to tack into the survey. So we only asked this question about public waters, which is big oversight, but still somewhat useful. So start off focusing on the angler side, where they're viewing themselves as most important. For people who are only fishing in the public, they rely on anglers a bit less than government. They actually have the government there, but the role anglers play is quite high. But if they're not getting this information from the people actually citing the regulations, what's going on? And the filling in the gaps are things we didn't look in the previous study. The information availability in public waters, although the majority say they are getting enough information on regulations, a lot are clearly saying this information isn't available to them, which shows that there's potentially even greater shortcome than we initially might have thought relative to what information is being made available by organizations that have quite a lot of responsibility for what's going on. Then going into the area that drove me into this broader research track is how much information are they getting on how to perform catch and release in correlation with the regulations that require it. And here we have a little bit of a difference from previously, where NGO is still at the top, but the second place goes to other anglers, which in the context of what we know about what's being presented in these freshwater fisheries makes sense if the information's not coming from other places. But if they're getting it from other anglers, where are those other anglers getting this from? Are they actually getting good information in Sweden? And again, I'll dive into a little more detail here. In this case, I'm looking at how this information is being communicated based on what species they're targeting, which was one of those big gaps that we found in our previous study. And here we can see information availability. So just pulling out the information on pike, where we knew there was a big gap in what was being communicated. A lot of people are saying there is enough information on pike, although we know that's not the case. It's improved a little bit since that study was first done. And here, the pike standing out, they're getting a huge amount, or they're relying a huge amount on other anglers to be providing them with that information. Furthering that idea that we need to really look at where are these people getting this information in the first place if they're not getting it from the government, so super low, the water owners, also super low. In fact, the recreational fishing industry is actually providing more information than organizations that are stating regulations that require catch and release, and in the case of these private water owners, have a vested interest in maintaining these resources because they're getting income directly from it, things like that. Then jumping forward to maybe look at potential ideas of compliance, and if we could get good information to these people, what they would do with it. We had a couple of extra questions looking at anglers' view on their potential role in fisheries supervision and how that looks in fisheries they're looking at. So here just is a breakdown of what people think about current levels of the quality of fisheries supervision, or level of number of conservation officers checking what's going out. And the majority are on the side of not enough or don't know, which shows, at least in this group, that there's a desire to have more people taking on this role to keep an eye on what's going on in the fisheries. Maybe a little bit of lack of trust of their fellow anglers, or just knowing more could be done. And that fits right in line with the fact that the vast majority of them haven't taken on this role before. And so a lot of people haven't acted as fisheries supervisors. And if they're not taking on this role, then obviously they're not doing this. And this study sample, being members of the National Angling Association, the number who have actually done this before is probably quite a bit higher than the national average, as these are more avid, committed, stewardship-focused individuals. But a lot of them would be willing to take on this role and receive education to do this, which is quite exciting from a perspective of how many people are actually wanting to engage, take some leadership, potentially be role models. In the case of enforcing regulations, it would be interesting to look into further how many of these people would also be thinking about what they're doing beyond just what's required and what needs to be enforced, but also their role as role models in this context. And that the breakdown here, it makes sense that if you're fishing more in private waters, you'd want to take on this role in private waters. If you're fishing more in public waters, you'd want to take on that role there. But across the board, it's almost 50% of our respondents said they would be interested in doing this. Intentions are one thing, behavior's another. We'd see how it plays out, but that's still quite a positive thing, looking at an added activity on top of your enjoyment of going out and fishing. And so I'll wrap up, if I can get to the last slide here, and try and summarize some of the key things we're pulling out of this data, where we could see, in line with what we had in our previous study, water owners are limited as a source of catch and release best practice information, although there are a huge number of them with a huge amount of control over the small areas that they're responsible for. And that government institutions were viewed as a limited source for both finding information on regulations and best practice information. This is something that could be related to the fact that a lot of their fisheries, you don't have to buy a license, so there's nowhere where you're being forced to go through a portal where this information is handed to you. But there's a few other challenges or things to unpack there as well. And that across the board, anglers see their peers as one of the most important sources of information on knowing what the fishing regulations are, knowing what best practices are. But in this context, if they're not getting this information from institutions with the resources to potentially be funding studies, gathering information, or who are trying to match it to the regulations that they're using, then how do we know that what they're getting is actually good and leading to the outcomes that we as researchers or fishery managers in the country would like to see? But if what we have on the information about their willingness to engage and take on a role as people managing these fisheries or as policing the fisheries, potentially, if they get this information, they're indicating they might follow it, or at least, we can hope that. Supposed to have a question mark coming up the end there. Anyway, thank you very much for your attention. I know we're excited for lunch, but if there's time for questions, I'll answer them now or after the picture, I guess.
Much, Samuel, for that interesting presentation. We do have time for one or two questions. Yep, okay, at the back. Yes, that's you.
So that's something we deliberately tried not to get into. One, because this is stuff that we tacked into other surveys when we were doing commissioned research, and hey, let's put in some extra questions, try and fill it out. So to tease out what forms of social media they're using, what types of presentation they're attending, or if they're looking at print media, television, other stuff, we didn't want to get too into the weeds there, one, number of questions wise, but also thinking the rate at which these communication platforms are evolving, and just in the time that I've been working on this, seeing how many people are switching from YouTube to Instagram, off of Facebook, and which groups are there, that it's a very complex information landscape. And we wanted to, regardless, or tried to phrase things so regardless of what way you're getting that information from the group, is it from that broader institution? And then the next step would be to look into what are the better pathways to do that and things like that. So we didn't, but it would be cool if we could have.
Thank you. We've got one more question.
So we haven't done any weighting on this yet, but we have done a previous study looking at this sample group, so the National Angling Association members, relative to the general population in a particular area, comparing their fishing levels and things like that. So moving forward with this data towards publication, that's something that we need to pull in and go, okay, is there like more or less there? But at the general level, we're also thinking this group being more experienced, avid, and engaged, they're going to have potentially a more knowledgeable picture of how much is actually being communicated from these sources. Whether or not that's particularly representative of what's reaching the general angling population, that's definitely going to be quite a disconnect. But if it's something that we can take to these institutions and go, okay, the people who know what you're doing are saying you're not doing this, it's got a little bit more weight on that side. So from the applied side, useful, but from the broader data quality interpretation side, it's something we have to deal with. But that we have, that paper's just published at the end of last year, we have got something that we can use as a base to take this and go in a little bit further with, which I'm glad to have done at least so that we can try and do a better job with that.
Thank you. Thanks, Samuel. We don't have time for any more questions, but if we can just give all of our speakers from around the world a warm round.